And thank you, Tracy, for getting us started. Morning, everyone. My name is Dan Martin, and I'm a lecturer here in sport and exercise psychology at the School of Psychology at Newcastle University. And I've got the pleasure this morning of chairing the first keynote, which is going to be delivered by Dr. Michael Passaportis. Michael's a lecturer in sport and performance psychology at the University of Sussex, and a sport and exercise psychologist in training as well through BASES, British Association of Sport and Exercise Sciences. His research is focused on the interplay between performance and well-being in professional sports, which is an interest I gather that's sort of come from his own experiences of being a professional athlete in the sport of rugby union, having represented his country, Zimbabwe, before. I'm really excited that we've managed to get Michael here today to speak to us about his research and just his all-round expertise on thriving in sport. I know Michael just from having completed our doctoral degrees at Portsmouth roughly the same times. And I've had the pleasure to listen to him talk quite a few times. And I know that this is going to be a really interesting keynote as a result of that. I think there's going to be implementations and takeaways for everyone here on the call, whether you're a coach, psychologist, athlete, student, or none of the above. So I'm really excited, and I'm going to stop blabbing on so that we can actually hear Michael talk. But in terms of questions, please just pop any questions that you have into the chat, and we'll get to those at the end. Or if you're feeling brave enough, you can unmute yourself and ask a question directly to Michael at the end. But that's enough of me. You're here to listen to Mike talk. So Mike, I'll pass over to you if you want to share your screen, and the floor is yours.
Great, thanks. Yeah, thanks, Dan, for that very kind introduction. Nothing like setting the bar high before I've even spoken. Hopefully I'll be able to live up to that. Can I just confirm that everyone can see that? See my screen? Great. There we go. All right, so yeah, firstly, good morning, everyone. I hope that you all are having a really good start to your day. I also hope that you are having significantly better weather than we are having in Cape Town at the moment. It's currently a storm going on outside, so yeah, I hope you're experiencing sunnier weather than we are. So, as kind of Dan introduced, my name is Michael Passaportis, and I'm a lecturer in sport and performance psychology at the University of Sussex. And I'm really looking forward to talking to you today about thriving, and more specifically, my own research exploring how to create environments within Olympic sport organizations where athletes can go on to thrive. Just as a bit of a spoiler, and it's right there in the title, but coaches have emerged from this work as really integral and really important to athletes being able to thrive, which I'm sure is not really a surprise to any other coaches in the audience. So thriving is a topic that I'm very passionate about. And I'm hopeful that today I can provide you with a theoretical understanding of what thriving is, but also with practical knowledge that can benefit you in your professional capacity. Sorry, just was making... So, whether that's as a coach, an athlete, a practitioner, or even just someone who is interested in the psychology of sport and performance, as that's something that I'm also really passionate about. This idea of creating knowledge that is beneficial and that can actually be used in practice by those on the ground. But before we get into the details of this talk, I just want to quickly, thank the organizers for the invitation to deliver this talk. I really do appreciate the opportunity to share my research and to talk about kind of the work that I've done. I must admit my imposter syndrome has been really clicking in an overdrive ever since I was asked to deliver a keynote. My mind's sort of telling me that someone as early on in their career as me is perhaps not really worthy of that task, but I'll certainly do my best to live up to the standards, certainly of the presenters who've been featured in this conference before, but also to the undoubtedly high level of the other people who will be presenting today. All right, so just as a brief outline or overview of what I'm going to cover today. I'll start off by having a look at what is meant by this term, thriving. As historically, there's been some confusion and some misunderstanding of the term, particularly in sort of academic contexts or academic texts, and that still exists to some extent today. From that, I will introduce a definition of thriving as development and success. This is a definition that I've used in my research, and hopefully I'll be able to provide some clarity around what thriving is and also an overview of how it is experienced. I'll then briefly introduce some understanding of what underpins thriving, particularly in athletes. And from that sort of basis, I'll then go on to talk about my own work, looking at exploring how we might promote thriving, particularly within Olympic sport organizations. And then I'll draw some implications from that, particularly for the coach-athlete relationship, because as I mentioned, that's emerged as a really significant impact on athletes being able to thrive. So as a way to kind of get us started and to get us thinking, I want you to have a little bit of a think around what the term thriving might mean to you. So I'm not going to ask anybody to feedback any of their answers or anything like that, but I do want you to have a think about this term, to thrive. Outside of this talk, where have you heard it before? What sort of situations or contexts has it been used? And what has it been used to describe? How might you use it yourself? So what does thriving mean to you? And what would you point at to say, or perhaps that person is thriving, or that's a thriving experience? As I said, I'm not going to ask for any responses here, but I do feel pretty safe in saying that there is going to be a lot of different answers to these questions. And that's because you've likely all heard the term thriving before, and you would have heard it used to describe multiple or myriad different situations or scenarios. So it's a safe bet for me to assume it will probably mean something slightly different to many of you. That being said, I'm also pretty confident to say that, if I were to collect all your responses and kind of group them together, and I examined what everyone had said and what you all thought thriving to be, we would find some common threads, sort of connecting these all. Common across all of your responses would likely be some sort of notion of excelling or doing really well, of achieving in life. And that's important to note, as the simple task really kind of had three purposes. The first was to get you thinking and engaged, which is good for me, as hopefully you'll end up enjoying the talk more. But secondly, I wanted to get us thinking about positive functioning, of excelling and doing well, which is what this talk is ultimately all about. But the third kind of point of this task is a really effective way for me to highlight the challenges that we've faced and continue to face as researchers trying to understand thriving and how we might be able to get people to experience it. And we're going to start off by looking at why that might be the case. The main issue we faced is that the word thriving is understood to mean different things depending on how it is being used. It's commonly used as an adjective to describe any number of sporting situations where athletes or teams, and maybe even organizations, are excelling in their sporting pursuits. A simple Google search will easily show what I mean here. And just as a quick disclaimer, I've borrowed the slides from my teaching slide deck, so these articles are slightly dated, but I have no doubt that any current search would turn up really similar results. And I'll just give you a moment to kind of read through the different headlines here. What we have here is athletes being described as thriving in several very different situations and scenarios. However, we can also find instances where teams are being said to thrive. So in these two examples, teams are said to thrive off completely the opposite situations. So some thriving while playing at home, others thriving while being on the road. And it can get even more complicated if we look beyond sport, as businesses have been described as thriving, and even whole entire economies can be described as thriving. So each use of the term thriving in these examples represents a different experience, depending on the person or the people involved and the context that that person is in, which makes it really difficult for us to pinpoint what thriving actually is. And I use these examples because I think they're a really useful way to make a point. And the point that I'm making is that the confusion and inconsistency we can see here surrounding what thriving is, it mirrors what's actually been going on in the wider academic literature as well, at least until recently. And that's because, similar to, reporters in the popular media, scholars researching thriving across multiple different domains have also viewed or conceptualized what they mean by thriving differently, depending on who they're studying or at what stage in that person's life. If we specifically look at research in sport, up until recently, there's been no real agreement on what thriving is. One of the earliest suggestions of thriving comes from Carver, where thriving was suggested to be an adaptive response to encountering difficulty or adversity. And it's illustrated on this graph here, where we're going along and we have a certain level of functioning in our lives. We experience an adverse event, some stress or some difficulty, and our functioning drops off. Thriving in this situation is seen as responding from that or rebounding to a level higher than perhaps we were before. Many uses of the term thriving have since kind of echoed these sentiments, certainly in sport. So Bull and colleagues suggested that thriving on pressure was a requirement of being mentally tough, while Wadey and Hanton have likened it to experiencing increased levels of functioning following an injury. Similarly, Harris and colleagues talk about thriving as a successful adaptation following joining a new professional team. We also have Kerr and colleagues who talk about this upward developmental trajectory across not just one sporting domain, but all areas of their life. And while we can see there's certainly similarities between the users of thriving here, we can also see there's little consensus on what thriving actually is. And so there's been no real clear direction for scholars to pursue. There's been no framework off of which we could build a systematic body of work that looks to understand human thriving and what it entails. Around about 2017, Brown and colleagues, recognizing this lack of understanding on thriving and what it means to thrive, conducted a review of all the extant literature that was available. And their aim was to overcome these issues and to advance the field by providing a really robust definition of thriving that would be applicable across different people, different populations, but also different domains. And from their review, they drew out all the similarities across the different uses of thriving, and they defined it as the joint experience of development and success. I'm going to break this definition down into its two components so that we can hopefully understand them a little bit more. Starting with the development part of thriving, this relates to the experience of making progressive enhancements to one's life. These can be physical, such as an infant learning to walk. They can also be psychological, like perhaps learning adaptive coping styles. And they can also be social, perhaps establishing a really strong and supportive friendship group. The success part captures how people are thriving when they achieve outcomes on tasks that are relevant to them, to their life stage and their context. For athletes, this might be achieving key performance indicators or having a successful performance. Perhaps in education settings, it might be getting really high attainment scores. It can also be something like being healthy or even having wealth. What's important here is that thriving is recognized as multifaceted, which is just a fancy way of saying that both development and success are required to be experienced at the same time for someone to be considered thriving. Being successful but not developing or growing as a person is not going to lead you to thrive. On kind of similar to that, if we're developing and growing, but we're not achieving success on things that are important to us, that's also not going to lead us to experiencing thriving. So we need to experience both of these things together. So that provided us with a really nice, clear definition of thriving as this experience of development and success. But the review also provided us with clarity on what it takes for someone to actually reach this desirable state and to be able to thrive. To achieve both the development and success necessary, an individual needs to experience full, holistic, optimal functioning, however you want to term it. But basically, they need to be doing well across multiple areas of their lives, not just in one. And this idea of full or holistic functioning is typically experienced when someone has high levels of well-being and performance. So well-being here is quite simply the state of being or doing well in life. And this can be physically, emotionally, psychologically, or even social in nature. High levels of well-being are important for thriving because they demonstrate that a person has the personal and social functioning necessary for development to occur for them. So they have the personal and social capabilities to take opportunities to better themselves and to grow. Turning to performance, this is experienced through the level of quality someone shows in the execution of an action, an operation, or a process. Basically, how well you're able to perform on a specific task that's relevant to you. How well we're able to perform on those tasks really reflects our level of functioning. And the argument is that if we achieve high levels of functioning, we're likely to be showing superior performance, which will ultimately help us to achieve success. So from this research, we now have a definition of thriving. It's this joint experience of development and success. And this experience, is characterized by an individual experiencing high levels of well-being and also high levels of performance. So we now know what it means to thrive. I provided this definition because it's important to acknowledge that other definitions and conceptualizations of thriving are still used by scholars in sports psychology research today. So there is still a little bit of a discrepancy in what it means to thrive. However, for the purpose of this talk and for the work that I've done in thriving, and the work that I'm going to discuss today, we've used this definition of thriving that I've just gone over. We believe development and success captures the thriving experience of athletes most accurately. All right, so I've given you the rundown on what we mean by thriving. So hopefully it's now clear on kind of what I'm talking about. This idea of experiencing development and success through high levels of well-being and performance. But that then might lead the question of what ultimately influences someone to thrive. There's a large body of work that's examined and predicted thriving, and I'm not going to go through all of that, but if you are interested and would like to find out more, I've linked to a review article at the bottom here that discusses this and goes into great detail around research specifically looking at these variables that I'm going to talk about now. But several important variables have been identified that are believed to influence thriving. And we can broadly group these up into two separate groups. The first is someone needs to have a set of personal enablers. So these are the attitudes, thoughts, and behaviors that an athlete expresses that helps them to thrive. So things like having a strong personal desire, really high quality motivation, personal resilient qualities, and even a proactive personality all help an athlete to be able to thrive. The second group are contextual enablers, which are the social agents and characteristics of the environment which can foster thriving. Social agents being basically the key people within an athlete's environment. And what's emerged as important here is social support. So athletes need to feel supported by these people that are around them. But more importantly, they need to have high quality relationships with them. So it's not just having people around you, it's really being able to connect and understand these people that offer you support. In addition to those two sets of enabler variables, we've also have two key processes. And basically these processes are the means through which those enabler variables might facilitate thriving. And these two ones are basic psychological needs satisfaction, which a really kind of well-known psychological construct that suggests that as human beings, we essentially have three core psychological needs. We have a need for autonomy, so feeling like we are in control. We have volition of our actions and our own lives. Feeling competent, like we have the skills and the capacity necessary to do what we need to. And also that we feel relatedness. So we feel like we belong and that we can connect with people. Having these needs satisfied ultimately leads to this full functioning and thriving. Alternatively, if these needs are thwarted or suppressed, that's been found to be really detrimental to thriving. Linking those personal enablers and contextual enablers to thriving is the experience or the view of a challenge appraisal, which is where an individual views an event or a situation as an opportunity for gain or growth, rather than as a threat or something to be kind of feared. Viewing events in this way has been found to really encourage athletes to engage with their training and their performance and create opportunities for positive change. And it's for these reasons that it has been previously associated with thriving. So these two processes, psychological need satisfaction and challenge appraisal, are what connect the enabler variables to thriving. To explain that with a bit of an example, we can consider an athlete who perhaps has the personal enablers of a proactive personality. This is likely to influence their personal beliefs, make them feel like they have a lot more control over events. If they feel like they have control, it's going to increase the likelihood of them making a challenge appraisal. And so they will view anything they encounter as an opportunity for gain and growth, and they will engage fully in that scenario. And this will ultimately lead to them potentially thriving. Despite there being really consistent and strong evidence for what underpins and predicts thriving, interestingly, there's been very little studies looking at how we might promote it. And this is somewhat surprising, especially given that the experience of thriving is something that would undoubtedly be beneficial, especially to athletes. And so this was a gap that we identified as really needing to be addressed. Now, how can we promote this really facilitative experience in athletes? And so we set out to conduct a body of work exploring how to promote thriving, specifically within Olympic sport organizations in the United Kingdom. And for the rest of my talk, I'm going to explore this work that we did. And we did that work with 3 separate Olympic sports in the lead up to the Tokyo Olympic Games. When we were reviewing the thriving in sport literature, what consistently came out to us, especially through the athletes' qualitative accounts of thriving, was that they really desired and wanted to be part of environments where they felt that they could trust those around them. Environments where they could build strong and meaningful bonds with their teammates, with their coaches, and their sport organizations. Importantly, as I mentioned earlier, it's not just having these connections, but it's the depth and the sincerity of these relationships that is found to be most important. And so identifying this, it led us to consider, out of all the processes and enablers that influence thriving, that the contextual enablers, the athlete's environment, might hold the most potential to influence their thriving. And so we focused our attention and our understanding on how to create environments within which an athlete could thrive. So our focus was to create these environments. But when considering the athlete's environment within which they can thrive, it's also really important to acknowledge that these environments, certainly at the elite level, are situated within sport organizations. And so we need to really look at the role that an organization plays in fostering an athlete's thriving. This is because athletes do not operate in a vacuum. They're not just a single person that goes out and competes. Even in individual sports, they're often surrounded by large groups of people. As such, we can no longer view athletes as separate or removed from the environments that they train and compete in. Actually, they function within these really complex, diverse, and often volatile organizational systems that exert really strong and really significant demands on both their well-being and their performance. And so if we're thinking about thriving and we're thinking about creating the sustained performance and well-being in their athletes, then this is going to be dependent on the teams that surround them, on their coaches, their support staff, their managers, and performance directors. We're seeing more and more in elite sport that the teams supporting athletes are growing and getting more diverse and more complex. So we wanted to ensure that we accounted for this when exploring how to promote thriving. Another key consideration we had was we really wanted any knowledge that we produced from this work to be transferable to those whose role it was to help the athletes to thrive. We didn't want to produce an academic text that didn't capture the realities of what promoting thriving within this environment would look like for those people who kind of had to carry out the work. Acknowledging this was really important because, as Wagstaff has argued, as researchers, we really need to do more to be able to translate our knowledge. So we need to ensure that we use cohort designs and longitudinal research so that we're able to sample these big teams that surround athletes. Because doing so will hopefully allow us to develop more effective knowledge translation partnerships with sport organizations. And this was really important to us. And it's also kind of key to note that these knowledge translation partnerships, they go both ways. So as researchers, we can bring our theoretical knowledge and kind of try to implement that into the environments that we're working in. But also we need to recognize that the people on the ground, they can provide us with really rich experience and really deep contextual knowledge. And it's actually the integration of these two knowledge systems that allows us to produce the most effective knowledge. So we really wanted to involve as many people as possible in understanding what it takes for an athlete to thrive, as we felt this would enable us to produce knowledge that could bridge what has been termed as essentially a growing no-do gap, where research is being produced, but it's not really making its way down to being implemented in practice. And Keegan has lamented this occurrence as pointed to the fact that typically as researchers, we kind of get on with research and practitioners get on with practice. So we're solving different problems using different methods and approaches to do this. We wanted to kind of bring those two groups together and work out what we could learn from each other. And so I'm going to go through now the research that we did. We did 3 different studies, and the first one is published and available to read. The second has just been accepted for publication in the Journal of Sport and Exercise Psychology just last week. So we're really hopeful that that should be out soon. And then the last study is hopefully going to go out to review soon. I'm not sure I'll have time to cover the third, but we'll kind of see how we get on. But ultimately with this work, we wanted to advance the theory and knowledge of thriving and to capture the realities of people in the applied settings. In that way, we would be able to incorporate the inherent complexity of sport And through involving these people who are working in the field, we would be able to translate theory into practice. But through their collaboration, we would hopefully be able to produce knowledge that was useful and practical. So this is the first study that we did. And this study was looking to promote thriving within a British Olympic sport organization. So this organization was actually already in the process of implementing their own change strategy to promote thriving, which provided us with a really great opportunity to explore what the features are of an athletic environment that might influence thriving, but also to understand how these features are connected across not only a range of individuals, but also a range of contexts. And so over a period of 16 months, I did what's called an ethnography. So I basically joined this organization and I was embedded within them for the duration of the study. I went along to training camps. I attended competitions. I sat in on management and leadership meetings. And I attended the readiness camps that they had for Tokyo. Throughout this period, I interviewed 18 athletes, 5 coaches, 3 sports psychologists, 2 physiotherapists, and 3 managers, including a coach development officer as well. So really making an attempt to capture the complex teams that surround athletes. And what we found from this was that constructing a thriving environment, in this instance, was predominantly done by enhancing the quality of social support that the athletes received. And this was done essentially through kind of targeting 3 main areas. The first was to really prioritize the coach-athlete relationship. So leadership of this organization recognized that the coach-athlete relationship was integral to athletes thriving, certainly within this sport. And so leadership specifically allowed time and space for coaches to get to know their athletes on a deeper level. The coaches felt that pressure to win was removed, and that they had time to really dedicate to creating strong relationships with their athletes and to adopt what Jawed and colleagues call a coach-athlete centered approach. Through this approach, coaches and athletes are given time to develop and grow alongside one another. So recognizing that it's a mutual relationship. Through such a relationship, athletes' experiences of their sport, their performance, and their well-being were found to be enhanced. Similarly, social support was also enhanced through creating a sense of cohesion and a real team ethos amongst the athletes. What was interesting from a coaching perspective was the responsibility for really driving this was given to the coaches. Coaches were tasked with ensuring that the teams that they coached were really cohesive. And they did this by, again, encouraging athletes to respect each other as individuals, to recognize and embrace that they can benefit from each other, from really knowing each other and understanding each other. They can receive benefits. They can share information on what works for them and what works for others. And they can also solve problems collectively. The third target area was the kind of building or the establishment of a differentiated athlete support network. This means that athletes were basically allowed to choose their own support teams. So athletes could choose from a pool of physiotherapists and coaches and strength and conditioning coaches on who they wanted to support them. Being able to construct their own support network meant that the teams that were around the athletes had much higher quality open relationships. This gave the athletes a lot more avenues for personal disclosure, so to share their needs and their preferences. It also provided them more opportunities for regular and informal communication. So having these really strong interpersonal connections meant athletes could advocate for themselves more. They could make their needs be known and their preferences be known more easily. What was most important to the organization to create an environment where athletes could thrive was that their main focus was on fostering these interpersonal relationships. And ultimately, they targeted 3 guiding principles. So each relationship was intended to be built on understanding, openness, and trust. And ultimately, this was successful in creating an environment where athletes were able to thrive. In our next study, we wanted to go a little bit further. So instead of just observing an organization that was already making change, we wanted to have a little bit more control in that situation. And we wanted to understand how we could draw on thriving research to promote thriving within an Olympic sport organization. We really wanted to kind of bridge the gap between theory and practice. And so we were able to partner with a sports psychologist working in a different sport organization who was looking to promote thriving. And so over a 9-month period, we collaborated with this practitioner through a form of participatory research, which is basically a process whereby researchers and participants really work together. And it's a systematic process where basically myself and the psychologist devised a plan of action based off of thriving research. This plan was then implemented into the organization. We would come back and reflect on how that had played out. So I would reflect on it from a more theoretical perspective, and the practitioner would reflect on it from a practical perspective. And we would then combine our reflections and our insights, sorry, we certainly weren't insulting, our reflections and our insights to then develop the next plan of action. And so we went through kind of 3 cycles of this reflection and action. We also then, to make sure what we produced was accessible, we also shared that with a number of neophyte sports psychologists to see kind of what they could get from it and how accessible they had found it. What we found was that those wishing to promote thriving, so be that a performance director, a coach, a manager, or a sports psych, they need to make sure that they have a really firm and in-depth understanding of the environments that they're a part of, and also the organizational systems that influence them. And we found this to be particularly true for sports psychs, as this involved developing competencies beyond what perhaps they had been taught through their formal education and their professional trainings. So this included things like the need to be politically astute, to manage complex relationships. There's a number of hierarchies that need to be managed. The sports psychologist also needs to be able to adapt theory to the language of their organization. Academic texts are often not really applicable on the ground, so the sports psychologist needs to be able to integrate the language already used in their organization into the theory to make it more accessible to those they're trying to influence. And then again, they need to be pragmatic with how they introduce that change. Specifically related to thriving, from this work, it's really important that a wide range of perspectives are heard when trying to understand what leads to an athlete thriving, and also what their thriving might look like. We found that with respect, certainly to social support, there were some quite big differences in how athletes were able to access this really important contextual enabler. And this was often dependent on their status within the team. So more experienced athletes, perhaps athletes with a history of success, they had an ability to influence the social environment that they were a part of. You know, they could stand up and really advocate for their own needs to ensure that they led the formation of these strong relationships. This wasn't the case for less experienced or novice athletes. Those athletes rather just had to kind of adapt to the environment as it was. And so it's really important that if we're creating environments for thriving, we're not only listening to the loudest voices or the most successful voices. We need to incorporate all the experiences of what it means to be part of that environment. Lastly, we also found thriving to be a really subjective experience and also quite temporal. So what that means is that what one athlete thrived on was not always the same for another. For instance, from this study, we found some athletes really thrived on monotonous training, where they were almost like a robot, just kind of grinding through the daily sessions that they were put through. And they thrived off that, they enjoyed that. Whereas others likened it to just basically surviving through their training. That wasn't what they were there for, and that was just something that they had to put up with so that ultimately they could go on and thrive in competition. So from this, we can see that creating an environment that fosters thriving is actually really complex, because a lot of care needs to be taken to ensure that when we promote thriving, all athlete voices are heard and that all athletes have an opportunity to thrive. And that's not going to really be a straightforward process, given that thriving is essentially a subjective experience. But we need to make sure that when we promote thriving, it's for all and not just for some. I'm a little short on time, so I'm just going to briefly kind of go through the third study. As I mentioned, this isn't out yet. But in this study, we worked with a different sport organization. And the focus here was to design and implement an induction program. So a program for new athletes coming onto the world-class program of this organization. Again, we reused participatory research, but a more action version of that, where we looked to collaboratively create knowledge. And here we involved more leaders in this process and more members of the organization. So we had senior leaders, sports psychologists, performance lifestyle advisor, coaches, and even backroom administrators, all working together with us as researchers to design this induction process that would ultimately go on to allow athletes to thrive. Again, what we found here was, interpersonal relationships are key. These are integral to athletes experiencing development and also success. And so with this program that we devised, we really wanted to target that early on. So the whole induction program was centered around athletes establishing these really deep interpersonal connections. And we did this through really prioritizing two things. The first was establishing trust. So trust was believed to be really the foundation on which high performance relationships are built. And it's a precursor to establishing levels of understanding between people. We also found it underpins the promotion of both performance and well-being. The second thing we found really important to target was establishing clarity. New athletes entering the environment needed to be really clear on where they stood and what that environment looked like so they could navigate it, specifically the social interactions. This gave them autonomy to take personal responsibility. They knew where to go to get their needs met. And it also facilitated effective communication. They were better able to communicate with their sports support staff to get the support that they need. Through establishing trust and clarity early on, athletes had an enhanced sense of belonging. Through trust, they felt safe and they felt accepted. And through enhancing clarity, they recognized where they fit with the system and how to operate within it. They also felt a sense of kind of value by the organization. So that's an overview of the research that we did. But as I mentioned earlier, coaches and the relationships that they have with athletes really emerged as essential for promoting thriving in any kind of high performance environment. And so I really want to kind of take out some of the key implications from this work so that I can hopefully give any coaches or kind of people involved in sport some takeaway messages on what's important for thriving. The first one is that coaches should be given time and opportunity to mold the relationships that they have with their athletes into meaningful, inclusive, and empowering connections. And these are founded on trust and clarity. The important consideration here is that this may require expectations and demands of winning to become the secondary focus, at least until such time as the relationship has been formed. Ultimately, we posit that this is going to end up being beneficial, as doing so will produce a resulting relationship that will be based on mutual trust and understanding. So dedicating time to really forming that relationship will increase the athlete's trust in that relationship as well, which will mean that they perceive the coach's actions as being really sincere and also of having the athlete's best interests at heart. What this does for coaches is it then provides the coach with confidence to draw on a broad range of motivational behaviors to both support, but also to challenge the athletes to really go on and enhance their performance. And they can do this safe in the knowledge that the athlete is really clear on what their intentions are. Obviously, with the caveat here that the coach needs to have good intentions, but I think that goes without being said. Additionally, prioritizing these relationships really facilitates safety in that relationship. And this creates a more effective high-performance relationship, as it allows for difficult and uncomfortable exchanges. High-performance sport is hard. Sometimes people need to be pushed. It also allows for challenge and disagreement. So it gives athletes the safety to be able to push back or to question things if they feel it's needed. And this has some quite close or similarities to previous research looking at unconditional positive regard. So if athletes feel like their coaches view them positively, irrespective of what their performance outcomes might be, they're much more likely to experience high levels of well-being and performance. So how can coaches ensure that they can create these relationships? Given that thriving is dependent on a really high-quality interpersonal relationship with a coach, we suggest that coaches looking to help their athletes to thrive should really try to promote opportunities for athletes to be able to engage in open and honest exchanges and to feel comfortable and able to share details about themselves. This might require coaches to actively create these opportunities for these relationships to develop. They might not happen with all athletes unless some are pushed. Again, some athletes might feel more capable to create these relationships, whereas others might not. When creating these exchanges, it must be done in a way that interactions are of a high quality and that athletes feel that they are able to be open and understanding and that there's a level of trust. This could be achieved by really developing and working on communication styles so that coaches are comfortable being empathetic and also constructive, as this has been found to likely support expansive and expressive emotional spaces and can generate trusting relationships where athletes feel safe to express themselves and to be seen for who they are, and safe to really communicate their needs and their preferences. It also allows the athlete to understand the coach better and to understand the coach's needs and their preferences as well. So hopefully that gives some kind of ideas on what a coach can do to be able to allow their athlete to thrive, specifically by focusing on the coach-athlete relationship. Just to provide a brief kind of summary. So we've spoken about thriving as this joint experience of development and success, which in sport is characterized by experiencing high levels of subjective well-being and also perceiving a high level of performance. Thriving has been found to be underpinned by several personal and contextual enablers, as well as two process variables of basic psychological need satisfaction and challenge appraisal. But contextual enablers might hold the key to creating environments for fostering athletes to thrive, certainly within sport organizations. And coaches have consistently emerged as really key social agents in athletes thriving. So strong relationships founded on openness, understanding, and trust could facilitate athletes to thrive. Coaches might look to create opportunities to really form these strong relationships where mutual understanding can be achieved. That's all I had time to cover today. So hopefully that's been interesting for you. I'm just going to quickly go to the reference slides if anyone's interested, just so that it's on the recording. And then I will go back here and hopefully open up to any questions people might have. But thank you very much for your time and for listening.
Mike, thank you so much. If we can just have a virtual round of applause, I really appreciate your time and the insights there. Yeah, questions, sort of taken away. Adam, I can see you've got one.
Cheers, Dan, and thanks for that, Michael. That was really interesting talk. So somebody who kind of does research around social support, I'm really interested in that element of things there. I just wanted to know, particularly maybe around that first study, I was really interested, how did you encourage this supportive environment or that social support to actually take place? Because you mentioned people could choose their own kind of support networks, and kind of assume most of the time we have that opportunity to build those. So was there any education around kind of what support is and why is it important, or yeah, what did you do to actually encourage it, I suppose?
Yeah, so actually with the first one, we were more observers. So as an ethnographer in that situation, I wasn't kind of making changes myself. I was observing the changes to be made. I think where the study kind of aligned with us is that at that point in time, the then English Institute of Sport, now UK Sport Institute, had a remit, I guess, to promote thriving within sport organizations. So it was on the sports organizations' radar already that this was something that they kind of looked to. Fortunately, this organization had kind of really bought into that. And they felt that this was something that they wanted to prioritize. So they had enhanced kind of their own knowledge of it, and they were now trying to promote thriving from their perspective. And we just kind of went in to observe that to see how it played out. And, you know, I think why it was successful was due to the nature of the sport. Social support was already quite prioritized. And so senior leadership had targeted this as something that they could really push. And yeah, it was quite novel, I guess, to allow athletes to be able to choose their own support networks. It's not often something that happens, but it was actually a really facilitative thing to do, because athletes, again, felt a lot more trust and a lot more connection, and were much more willing to engage with those people. So hopefully that kind of answers your question.
That's grand, thank you, cheers.
Lovely. David, I can see a hand up.
Yes, hi. I really have enjoyed that talk that you have done, and also myself being a student in master's sports psychology, I'm doing research in coach-athlete relationship in the sport of powerlifting. As myself, I'm a competitive powerlifter and a coach, and I want to get what makes a really good athlete slash coach from both perspective and how that can impact coach-athlete relationship. Now, I have found research that are including things like the 3C plus 1C model, the compass model, and many different other questionnaire scales. And from kind of your own research, which kind of questionnaires, scales, and models would you say are the most important ones when we are considering a really good coach-athlete relationship?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really great question, and it sounds like some really interesting work that you're doing. You've got me a little stumped here. So I'm predominantly a qualitative researcher, so I haven't really looked at much of the scales around there. But I think what's emerged from our research is, you know, these high performance environments are difficult. They're hard. They're full of challenge, and they're full of demanding situations. What has really helped athletes to be able to thrive in that is having that sense of support through their coach, someone who really understands them, and someone who really sees them and is able to push them and challenge them, but in a way that they feel safe and that they feel trusted. So there is some work by Davis and colleagues looking at the role of psychological needs satisfaction through coaching behavior. And that's been found to really influence an athlete's ability to thrive, so to perform well and to kind of be well. So the key mechanism in much of the quantitative research is that the coach supports an athlete to thrive by satisfying their basic psychological needs and through creating a sense of challenge appraisal. So from my side, that would kind of be what we think is most important in terms of thriving.
Brilliant. Thank you very much.
Perfect. And then I think we have time for one more. There's one in the chat here from Jeff. Mike, so did you find there were occasions when the experienced or high achieving athletes advocated for the less confident or experienced athletes?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And it's actually, so in that second study, that's actually where this advocacy came from. So it was during COVID, we had limited access to athletes. So when kind of understanding what thriving looked like in that sport, we had access to a group of really experienced athletes who've been to multiple Olympic Games, multiple gold winners. And they were kind of talking about their experiences of thriving. And they were the ones who noted that, you know, for them, they had control in those environments. They could approach the coach. They could ensure that their needs were being met. And they recognized that that was not the case when they were novice or when they first joined. So by virtue of them being more experienced and also by them having kind of earned their way through being successful, they were much more prominent and kind of able to do that. I was going to say something and it's completely kind of gone out of my mind. If it comes back in, I'll kind of bring it up. But basically, yeah, this idea that more experienced athletes advocating for the less confident and experienced one, it actually came from the more experienced athletes.
Oh, great. Lovely. Okay, well, I think we've kind of hit time anyway, and I have plenty of questions to ask you, Mike, but I have to ask them another time. Thank you so much for your time. I think we all really appreciate you giving up your time to talk today and talking on areas that are really interesting, and hopefully we'll see a lot of this out in some of the journals in plenty of time. I'm going to hand back over to Amelia, who's just going to lead us into our break. But thanks, Mike. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, everyone.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mike. It was absolutely brilliant. If I just share my screen very quickly, and hopefully, there we go. So we just got a short break now. It was more in case anyone ran over. We always do it just in case. So feel free just to grab a cup of tea, toilet break, etc. Up next, we have our sports psychology workshops, which are held by our master's students. So I'll run through this very quickly. People can step away, absolutely fine. But at 10:20, we have two different workshops going on at the same time. One is titled Coach Self-Care and the other one is Relationship Skills. These are all run by our master's students here at the university, and they do require a little bit of interaction. So please feel free to be on the chats, to speak to them, etc. The more interaction, probably the better. I'm saying this for the master's students, apologies if not. Yeah, so these will open, the breakout rooms will open in a couple of minutes. You can or should be able to self-allocate. If there are any issues, please let someone know. Most of the support team now have their name and ICP support. If you just either flag it to one of them, message them, etc., they will be able to allocate you. Just let them know which room you'd like to be in. This is the same for when this changes at 10:55. So there's a small break just for any overrun, just for people to move to make sure that they're in the right rooms for the talks that they'd like to be in. So at 10:55, the second lot of the workshops kick off, both very similar around the coach-athlete relationship. One is to do with motivational climate, and the other one is exploring new directions. I don't want to reveal too much of what it is all about, but it should be really good CPD workshop from what I've seen. So I'll let people go, come back. I'll keep this open for a little while, and Tracy will open the breakout rooms really shortly. There we go, perfect. It's like said it and it's happened. So you can start to allocate yourself now.